Hello and welcome back to I Completed 80s Music with me, the 80s Mixtaper. Consider me your pop culture bank manager, spoodling out music in a steady stream to keep you afloat with 80s tunes. I think that might be my worst analogy yet. Anyway, before we get into today's episode, if you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help keep it going, I'd be incredibly grateful for your support. Each episode takes around 3 hours of research, 2 hours to record, and another 2 hours for setup and managing social media. So about 7 hours of my week. And with 78 episodes, that's nearly 39 hours of free content for everyone. I have considered doing something on Patreon, like extra content or maybe the same premise, but with a different music theme. But I'm reluctant to go down that route. And while you may have heard ads on the pod, let me tell you now that in just over a year of advertising and 12,000 listens, I have made $10. There are paper rounds, in fact, every paper round, which pay more than that. You're probably not aware, but I'm currently unemployed. The podcast is a real labour of love and is one of the few things keeping me sane. If you fancy buying me a coffee or subscribing via my Buy Me a Coffee page, it would mean the world to me and really help cover the costs. Your support keeps the 80s tunes flowing. Thank you. The link is in the episode description. We had an outpouring of love this week over on Threads as well. And I have to say, Threads is becoming the Gen X hangout, especially where this podcast is concerned. Businesses are booming over there. And in particular, one song garnered all the attention. That was Hazel O'Connor's Will You, which we featured way back in episode 24.5. This haunting lament with one of the best saxophone solos I've ever heard seemed to really hit the right note with people. Tim P says McGugan, who was the saxophonist, has a tone to make me weep. Colin Baker 737 said that solo was later used as the theme tune for Ennell's Point. I believe the BBC brought out a single with just the sax solo. I didn't know that. Robert Slater 89 said I had a crush on Hazel at comprehensive school and was 14 at the time. Yeah, that single, actually all of Hazel's music of this period is incredible, and I still remain slightly baffled that the momentum didn't result in absolute megastardom. It is odd, but it's so lovely to see people still totally inspired by Hazel O'Connor's music. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, you can find me on Instagram, Threads, TikTok and YouTube as the 80s Mixtaper. Or if you're old school like me, you can email me at completed80s, that's 80s, completed80s at AOL.com. Yes, I am old enough to have an AOL account. So what do we have in store today as we enter playlist 39 in April 1982? Well, Bucks Fizz follow up their success with a song that cements them not just as Eurovision lovelies. We gain a PhD or a diamond, depending on your music streaming service. All will be revealed on that one. We get a one-hit wonder courtesy of a former Grange Hill star, but one which opened doors for Asian performers. Both Shakatak and Pigbag have their shining moment. Roxy music mature beautifully, and Simple Minds see us out with the start of their 80s imperious phase. As always, we cannot play the songs on the pod due to copyright laws, but if you visit the episode description, you will find hyperlink track listings for both Spotify and Apple Music, taking you right to the songs mentioned, plus a full track listing, should those links not be available on your pod platform of choice. So most people flip between the pod and the tunes to get the context. Anyway, let's get back to the music. So we start today with everyone's favourite skirt-ripping Eurovision sensations, Bucks Fizz. It is 1982 and the United Kingdom is currently vibrating at a very specific high-frequency pitch. We are past the primary colours and the Velcro rip charm of making your mind up. We've moved through the eerie synthesised nursery rhyme woods of the land of make-believe, which we heard in episode 33. And that hit number 1 in January and proved that Bucks Fizz were not just a one-off Eurovision fluke, but a meticulously engineered pop machine. The architect behind this machine is a man named Andy Hill. If you want to understand the British pop landscape of the early 80s, you have to understand Hill's obsession with the perfect sound, a sound that was often compared to ABBA, but possessed a twitchier, more British anxiety to it. When we last saw the group, they were navigating the dark metaphors of Land of Make-Believe, but for the follow-up, Hill and co-writer Nicola Martin decided to lean into the technology of the era. They decided to look through the lens. This is a song about surveillance. It's a song about the objective, unfeeling eye of the shutter. It's a song that sounds like it was recorded inside a glass box while someone frantically clicked a Nikon F3 in the background. It is sharp, it is staccato, and it's arguably the most complex arrangement the group ever attempted. This is My Camera Never Lies, track 1, playlist 39. Press play now. My Camera Never Lies was released in March 1982 and by April the 17th had become Bucks Fizz's third and final number one hit in the UK. It replaced Seven Tears by the Goombay Dance Band at the top of the charts. The song is the second single from their second studio album Are You Ready? Musically, it is demonstrative of Hill's kitchen sink production style. The track is built on a nervous, driving bass line and a series of vocal gymnastics that are notoriously difficult to perform live. If you listen to the chorus, the layering is dense. Cheryl Baker, Jay Aston, Mike Nolan and Bobby G are all working in a tight, contrapuntal harmony that feels more like a 1940s jazz vocal group than a 1980s pop quartet. The lyrics deal with the protagonist catching a partner in a lie, backed by photographic evidence. My camera never lies anymore, so I put you in the picture and cut it down to size. It reflected a growing cultural obsession with the paparazzi and the idea that the image was becoming more real than the person. In a 1982 interview with Record Mirror, the band discussed their shift in their sound, noting they wanted to move away from the bubblegum label. Bobby G said, "We want to be a group that's respected as much as ABBA or any other major pop group. We're not just a manufactured group. We've got more to offer than just a gimmick." And on the subject of the Land of Make-Believe, it was a much more subtle song. It proved we could do something a bit more sophisticated than just a chorus that everyone could hum. The production of the track reportedly took weeks, with Hill demanding dozens of takes to get that sharp vocal delivery exactly right. This perfectionism paid off. Smash Hits magazine, the arbiters of cool in 1982, gave the song a positive review, noting the cleverness of the arrangement. The music video furthered the theme, utilising rapid-fire editing and an almost Big Brother-like motif, though large amounts of hairspray and white leopard skin outfits were fully in effect. However, being at the top is exhausting. While My Camera Never Lies solidified their status as the UK's premier pop group at that moment, the pressure of maintaining this level of intricate vocal work was beginning to show. In later retrospective interviews, member Cheryl Baker noted that this era was a whirlwind of 18-hour days. But for 3 minutes and 45 seconds, the focus was perfect, the exposure was correct, the camera didn't lie. Bucks Fizz was still the biggest pop group in Britain. Next up, for the first time on this pod, and hopefully the only time, we have a divergence in recordings. I would hope that it's been noted by the few that listen to this pod that generally were you to play the same song on my playlist for both Spotify and Apple, the tunes are exactly the same version. I go to painstaking efforts to make sure this happens. Well, this week for the first time it's proved an impossibility. But let's introduce the song first and then I'll explain the difference. We briefly flick back to 1981. We are talking about a year when the post-punk frost was beginning to melt into the neon glow of the new romantic movement. But there was still room for something fundamentally yearning. The song we're looking at today fits this yearning category. It's a song that occupies a very specific space. It's the sound of a man who is perhaps one minor inconvenience away from total emotional collapse, yet he's delivering it over a synth pop backing that feels as crisp as a fresh banknote. That man is Jim Diamond. It's a song that shouldn't work as a pop juggernaut, yet it became one of the defining sounds of the early 80s, and yet is largely forgotten. I'm talking, of course, about I Won't Let You Down by PhD. Now, if you have Spotify, you're about to hear the original PhD version. If you have Apple Music, try as I might, it's not on Apple Music, so you're going to hear Jim Diamond's own solo version. Both are good. Diamond's own version is smoother and more consistent, but PhD's version is raw, and there is so much more fire and emotion in the track, and makes the room, 20% more dusty, if you will. It's visceral, it's beautiful, so if you can, listen to the Spotify version. This is track 2, playlist 39. The thing about I Won't Let You Down is the voice. It's a voice that reveals so much emotional turmoil. It's a voice that suggests Jim Diamond might actually be physically reaching for the person he's singing to, stretching his vocal cords until they hit a falsetto that feels less like a technique and more like a desperate plea. It's rich, it's angular, and it's deeply, deeply soulful. I have to admit that the PhD version is one of my favourite tracks from the entire decade. It's in the top 50 somewhere for sure. But before we get to the heartache and the synthesizers, we have to talk about how we got here. We have to talk about 3 men, a drummer, a keyboardist and a singer, who decided that their collective surnames were prestigious enough to form an acronym. Let's start with the man himself, Jim Diamond. Born in Glasgow in 1951, Diamond was a man possessed by the soul of the American R&B greats. Jim Diamond cited Ray Charles as his number one musical influence throughout his life, starting from his childhood. He explicitly stated in interviews that he grew up listening to Ray Charles, Sam Cooke and Otis Redding. He wasn't some manufactured pop idol, he was a journeyman. He cut his teeth in the Glasgow club circuit with the Gully Foyle Band before moving to London. By 1976, he was fronting a band called Bandit. Now, Bandit is one of those 6 Degrees of Separation bands. Their lineup included Cliff Williams, who would very shortly afterwards leave to join AC/DC, and there we know the rest is history in terms of rock god context. Bandit signed to Arista Records, released a self-titled album, and even played the Reading Festival. But the punk explosion essentially sucked the air out of the room for polished rock acts. Diamond, undeterred, headed to Los Angeles. He spent time working with Eddie Money and Earl Slick. He was a guy who was always right there on the edge of the big time, possessing a voice that everyone in the industry knew was world class, but he hadn't found the right vehicle yet. That vehicle arrived in the form of Tony Hymas and Simon Phillips. Tony was a keyboardist who had been working extensively with the legendary Jeff Beck, specifically on the There and Back album. Simon Phillips was and is one of the most respected session drummers in history, having played with everyone from Judas Priest to The Who. They formed PhD, Phillips, Hymas and Diamond. They signed to Atlantic Records and went into Rampart Studios in South London, which was owned by The Who. The resulting self-titled debut album, released in 1981, was a strange, beautiful hybrid. You had the technical precision of Phillips and Hymas mixed with Diamond's raw, blue-eyed soul. I Won't Let You Down was the standout. According to the credits, the track was written by Diamond and Hymas. While the song is often remembered as a pure synth-pop ballad, it actually features some incredibly intricate musicianship, though it's all subservient to that central hook. The lyrics are a quintessential "please don't leave me" narrative. Diamond sings about his failures to be the second person in the relationship and about the mundane but essential promises that underpin it, and that frantic realisation that those promises might not be enough. The song was initially a slow burner. It was actually released in 1981 but didn't truly explode until 1982. When it did, it went massive. It reached number 3 on the UK singles chart and became a top 10 hit across Europe, hitting number 1 in Belgium and number 2 in the Netherlands. The success of I Won't Let You Down essentially transformed Jim Diamond from a respected industry journeyman into a household name. However, the momentum of the band was tragically cut short. Just as they were preparing to capitalise on their success, Diamond contracted a severe case of hepatitis. He was sidelined for months, and by the time he recovered, the moment for PhD as a group had largely dissipated. They released a second album, Is It Safe, in 1983, but it failed to replicate the debut success. Prevented by his illness from touring, the group disbanded. But for Jim Diamond, the story didn't end there. I Won't Let You Down had proven that the public was hungry for a specific brand of emotional high-register soul. This set the stage for his solo career in the mid-80s, and two songs we'll hear much later on this pod, where he would eventually hit number one in the UK with I Should Have Known Better in 1984. He became a staple of the decade, even providing the theme tune Hi-Ho Silver for the television series Boone. But it all comes back to that 1981 recording, that moment where a Glasgow boy's voice met a wall of synthesizers and told us with absolute heartbreaking certainty that he wasn't going to let us down. And he didn't. Time for a one-hit wonder. For track 3, we're tuning into a sitar in the suburbs. Much like our previous track, our next song proved a brief antidote to the New Romantics sharpening their eyeliner, post-punk survivors debating whether synths were the future or a betrayal. And then, amidst that synthesized chaos, something arrived that sounded like it had travelled across continents to land in your living room. It was Ever So Lonely by the trio Monsoon. It was a stylistic outlier of the highest order. You had a driving, propulsive beat, a classic pop rhythm, but it wasn't anchored by a standard electric guitar. It was held down by the sitar, the tambura, and the singular crystalline voice of a 16-year-old Sheila Chandra. It felt like the future and the ancient world colliding at high speed. When it reached number 12 in the UK in May 1982, for a fleeting moment, the drone of the East was the heartbeat of the West. Press play now. Monsoon was an Anglo-Indian trio formed in 1981, comprising singer Sheila Chandra, multi-instrumentalist and producer Steve Coe, and bassist Martin Smith. Chandra, a South Londoner from Clapham, had already reached a national audience as an actress, playing Sudhamani Patel in the BBC school drama Grange Hill from 1979 to 1981. Coe, a producer who had previously worked with bands like Status Quo, was searching for a South Asian vocalist to realise his vision for an indie pop fusion. He discovered Chandra through a demo tape she had sent to Hansa Records when she was just 14. The band's debut was actually a 4-track EP on the independent indie pop label in 1981, but they were soon scouted by David Claridge and signed to the Mobile Suite Corporation, a subsidiary of Phonogram. Ever So Lonely was the spearhead. It was written by Coe specifically to confront the xenophobic climate of Britain at the time. As Chandra would later reflect in a 2022 Guardian interview, the Asian community was largely marginalised or mocked in mainstream media at the time. Her appearance on Top of the Pops, wearing a sari and a bindi, was a radical act of representation. She was the first South Asian woman to appear on the programme, making history while she was still a teenager. So many people, especially from the Asian community, have contacted me over the years to tell me how significant it was for them, says Chandra. It was revelatory for younger Asians to see one of their own on TV. The production of Ever So Lonely was balanced. It featured Ravi Shankar's disciple Dari Manku on sitar and Markandi Mishra on tabla. Yet it was polished with a glossy, radio-friendly sheen. However, the success of the single created a rift. Phonogram, sensing a massive pop star in the making, began to pressure the group to lose the Indian influence and pivot towards a more conventional Western pop sound. In an interview on Roots World and Chris Nixon, Chandra said, "We felt like kids in a sweet shop, as virtually no one had broken that ground. But Phonogram saw the Indian influence as more of a costume, as cultural appropriators usually do. It wasn't entirely their fault. That was the prevailing attitude in audiences of the time, and as a commercial concern, they were simply responding to it. And having done Indian stuff, they wanted us to take it off. To the label, the sitar was a gimmick. To the band, it was the raison d'etre. Refusing to compromise, Monsoon effectively dissolved by the end of 1982, shortly before their only album, Third Eye, was even released in 1983. But a great vocal never truly dies, it just waits for a new tempo. In 2001, nearly 20 years after the original release, British producer Dave Lee, working under the name Jakarta, revisited the track. He took Chandra's original vocal stems and wove them into a lush, atmospheric house production titled So Lonely. Released in early 2002, the Jakarta version became a massive club and radio hit, eventually peaking at number 8 on the UK singles chart, actually surpassing the original's peak of 12. It brought Sheila Chandra back to Top of the Pops 2 decades later, proving that the ethereal ragga she pioneered was not a relic of the 80s, but a timeless blueprint for global electronic music. For track 4, the last time we caught up with the Cheltenham Art School collective Pigbag, they were navigating the turbulent post-punk landscape of 1981. We left them in episode 31.5, right as they were finding their footing, having just released the funk-infused Sunny Day. It was a moment of transition. The band was experimenting with sound, geography and momentum, trying to figure out if they were a fleeting collective or something with staying power. But to truly understand the friction and the triumph of this band, we have to look to the track that anchored them, the one that defined their existence, haunted their legacy, and eventually catapulted them into a surreal, inescapable realm of mainstream fame and football stadium noise. It is an instrumental that somehow turned a group of avant-garde jazzers into a stadium-filling pop phenomenon. Before we unpack how a 20-minute jam session about a warthog printed bag became one of the most recognisable riffs in British music history, let's go back to the source. This is Papa's Got a Brand New Pig Bag. Press play now. When we left the Pig Bag story in 1981, they were already chasing the tail of their own success. The real story of Papa's Got a Brand New Pig Bag didn't begin in a glossy studio. It began in a room with black walls at Beach House in Cheltenham. The core idea for the song was written by Chris Hamlin and James Johnston, though it was refined through the collective improvisational energy of the entire group. As band member Ollie Moore later recounted, they were raw self-taught musicians who often lacked a grasp of standard bar lengths. When they went to Berry Street Studios in London in March 1981, they were confronted with the challenge of structure. To manage the chaos of their free-blowing solos, band member Roger Freeman stood in front of them with a stopwatch, signalling them to wrap it up after 1 minute. The title was a play on the James Brown classic Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. The Pig Bag name itself was a reference to a cloth bag Hamlin carried, which featured a screen-printed warthog. After the initial 1981 release, the song became a cult dance floor staple, but it didn't immediately hit the mainstream charts. Their manager, Dick O'Dell, made a move that was, in hindsight, masterfully shrewd. He withdrew the record from sale after it had built up significant momentum in the clubs. This created a vacuum of demand. When the single was re-released in 1982, it rocketed up the UK singles chart, peaking at number 3. The success was a complicated blessing. By the time the band appeared on Top of the Pops in April 1982, the lineup was shifting. Roger Freeman, famously disinterested in the commercial demands of the show, specifically the requirement to trade his signature donkey jacket for a suit, left the band on the day of their first appearance. The song, however, lived on, transcending the band entirely. I mean, surely at this point we've all heard it. It became the sonic backdrop for a generation, serving as the theme for the Canadian TV show The New Music, and becoming a perennial fixture at football terraces across the UK, particularly at Queen's Park Rangers and Middlesbrough. It successfully bridged the gap between the avant-garde post-punk scene and the uninhibited joy of the dance floor, even if it left the band members themselves with a complicated relationship with their own biggest hit. For track 5, we're back with Shakatak. While 1982 is caught in a haze of post-punk, new wave and new romantics, in the clubs, the ones with neon strips and chrome bar stools, there is a different movement happening. It's the British jazz funk explosion. We last checked in with Shakatak in episode 32.5. It was late 1981 when Easier Said Than Done peaked at number 12 in the UK singles chart. That was the breakthrough. It was the moment Bill Sharp's crystalline piano lines stopped being background music for late-night BBC radio transitions and started becoming the soundtrack to a specific kind of British aspirational cool. But if easier said than done was the invitation to the party, the next track was the moment the sun went down and the city lights took over. This is Nightbirds. Press play now. Whenever I think of coffee table music, i.e. music you listen to with a mug of filter coffee perched on a coffee table, this is always the song I think of. I know it's a weird, unbelievably specific digression, but I just needed to get it off my chest. Anyway, Nightbirds is the title track of Shakatak's second studio album released in 1982 on the Polydor label. Let's talk about the sheer technical precision of the core quartet. Bill Sharp on keys, Keith Winter on guitar, George Anderson on bass and Roger Odell on drums. In an era where the synthesizer was beginning to dominate the airwaves with heavy robotic textures, Shakatak went the other way. They went for lightness, they went for air. The song was recorded at Strawberry Studios in Stockport and mixed at Polygram Studios in London. According to the band's history, the track was crafted to capture the refined energy of the era, balances Sharp's sophisticated, melodic sensibility with the rhythmic drive of London's jazz funk scene. The single reached number 9 on the UK singles chart in 1982, marking their first ever top 10 single in their home country. The magic of Nightbirds lies in its instrumental forward structure. It doesn't tell a dense narrative, it evokes a feeling. The vocals, provided by Jill Soward and Jackie Raw, are used more like instruments than traditional narrative messengers, contributing to the wall of sound production aesthetic. But the story of Shakatak isn't just a UK story. Nightbirds became a cultural phenomenon in Japan. The band found immense success there, with the Nightbirds album entering the UK charts at number 4 and achieving gold status. However, the Japanese market embraced the band with such fervour that they became one of the most successful foreign acts in the country, leading to the band recording several live albums in Tokyo and maintaining a prolific output specifically for Japanese fans for decades. Musically, the song is a delicious slice of the 4/4 jazz funk pocket. George Anderson's bass line isn't just keeping time, it's providing a percussive counterpoint to Sharp's piano, played on a Bosendorfer Grand alongside Fender Rhodes and Oberheim synthesizers. It's a track that feels like it's constantly moving forward. It represented a shift in British music where jazz was no longer a dirty word for the youth, provided it had a beat you could dance to or drink coffee to. Critics at the time were occasionally dismissive, with some labelling the sound cocktail jazz, or in my case, coffee table music, but that misses the technical craft involved. As Bill Sharp has noted in various retrospective interviews, the goal was always musicality first. There are no shortcuts in Nightbirds, just accomplished musicians playing at the absolute top of their game. It remains their signature song, a 3.5-minute slice of 1982 that still feels like a cool breeze on a humid night. It's the sound of a band that knew exactly who they were. Right at the moment, the world was ready to listen. Next up, we return to another harebrained theory of mine, that Roxy Music, through 3 songs between 1981 and 1982, increased the Yuppie Baby explosion exponentially. I like to call it the Roxy Music Sex Trilogy, where through the songs Jealous Guy, More Than This and Avalon, junior partners in law firms and accountancy practices in Sloane Square and their girlfriends, fiancés and wives would slow dance in their far too hot apartments with any or all of these 3 songs playing before some How's Your Father, and thereby increasing the yuppie population of future Hugos and Francescas. I freely admit it's a daft theory. Anyway, today we talk about the middle song of the trilogy. The last time we checked in on Brian Ferry, he was whistling. It was 1981, and Roxy Music were draped in the solemn velvet mourning of Jealous Guy, a tribute to the recently departed John Lennon that became the band's only UK number 1 single. It was a moment of peak poise, clean, elegant, and deeply respectful. And if you're me and didn't know the John Lennon related context, a romance sexy song in a hot flat in Kensington. But by the time the calendar turns to 1982, the sharp edges of art rock had been buffed away entirely, replaced by something far more atmospheric and expensive sounding. We're talking about the album Avalon. We're talking about the finality of a certain type of cool. Bryan Ferry has always been the ultimate curator of his own mythology. If the early 70s Roxy music was a neon-lit collision of 50s rock and roll and space-age futurism, the early 80s iteration was the sound of a man retiring into the final silky, mature, crooning stalwart he had become. They had moved from the noise of the city to the stillness of the lake. More than this is the lead track and the thesis statement of this era. It is a song that emerges from a wash of synthesizers like a yacht appearing through a morning mist. It's arguably the most polite goodbye in the history of rock music. This is track 6, press play now. The recording for the Avalon album was a long, fragmented process taking place across 3 studios: Gallery in the UK, Compass Point in Nassau, and the Power Station in New York. As engineer and producer Rhett Davies noted in Sound on Sound, this was a departure for the band. Instead of capturing a live performance, they built the songs from the ground up, often starting with a Lindrum machine groove. Ferry was notoriously meticulous, often layering synthesizers and guitar textures over these sketches for months. He would hum melodies to find the shape of a vocal line before committing to final lyrics. The guitar work, that shimmering occasional liquid lead, was performed by Phil Manzanera. He and the band were consciously aiming for a dreamlike state, using signal processing to ensure the guitar felt less like a rock instrument and more like a fluid synthesized texture. The track structure is notably sparse. Ferry finishes his vocal line halfway through, and the song drifts into an atmospheric instrumental coda for the remaining parts. When it was released in March 1982, it hit number 6 on the UK singles chart. It didn't make the Billboard Hot 100 in the States, though it did reach number 58 on the Billboard Top Tracks chart. The song's themes of transience and the inevitability of endings felt prophetic. Avalon would be the band's final studio album. They reached the peak of this specific sophisticated mountain and decided there was nowhere left to climb. It remains the defining artifact of sophistipop, the sound of a band dissolving into the ether, perfectly dressed and completely composed. We shall meet them once more with Avalon soon. We end today with the beginning of Simple Minds' imperious moment. We last left our heroes in 1981 amidst the dense, cold and intricate atmosphere of the Sons and Fascination era. They were a band of high ambition, deep rhythms and synth-laden mystery. Yet, despite their creative output, the mainstream success they seemed to be chasing remained frustratingly just out of reach. All that was about to change. If you were a fan in 1981, you were likely immersed in their darker, more art rock textures. But as we move into the early months of 1982, something fundamental shifted within the band's creative engine. They were tired of the obscurity. They decided it was time to step into the light. And they did it with a song that functions as a bridge, a pivot point where the moody, echo-laden shadows of their past finally met the technicolor, high-gloss ambition of their stadium-filling future. It's a track that feels like a sunrise after a very long, very moody night. Here is Promised You a Miracle. This is track 7, playlist 39, our final track today. When Promise You a Miracle hit the airwaves in April 1982, it signalled a transformation, reaching number 13 on the UK singles chart, the band's first major commercial breakthrough. According to band history, the inspiration for the track's rhythmic feel came from a tape drummer Kenny Hislop, who had recently joined the group, brought back from a trip to New York. While listening to the radio there, he recorded a funk song called Two Through by the group T.S. Monk. The band became obsessed with the brass and keyboard hooks they heard on that recording. They translated those rhythms into their own rehearsal sessions, stripping away the complex, sprawling arrangements that defined their 1981 work in favour of a tighter, more disciplined pop framework. Producer Peter Walsh, who had previously worked on Heaven 17's Penthouse and Pavement, was brought in to harness this new direction. He encouraged the band to focus on the hook and to sharpen the vocal delivery. The result was a track that sat comfortably alongside the emerging new pop sounds of the time, such as those by ABC or the Associates, while retaining the band's unique atmospheric DNA. It was also a transient moment for the band's personnel. The recording sessions for the album New Gold Dream were fluid. Kenny Hislop played drums on Promised You a Miracle, but he would depart the group shortly after the recording of the single. The drumming duties for the remainder of the album were shared between Mike Ogletree and session player Mel Gaynor, the latter of whom would eventually become the band's long-term drummer. The song's success paved the way for the band's debut on Top of the Pops in April 1982, a pivotal moment that broke their barrier to the mainstream. It didn't just sell copies, it unlocked a decade-long streak of high-charting success in the UK. It proved Simple Minds didn't have to sacrifice their art to find their audience. They just had to learn how to let the colour in. So that's the first half of Playlist 39 done and dusted. But do stick around for more next week, where David Bowie returns with a feline theme. Bardo attempt to do what Bucks Fizz had last done at Eurovision. The J. Giles Band had one chilly last track up their sleeve. Bananarama return the favour to Funboy 3. England get the World Cup song right. And Haircut 100 have their surprisingly short-lived ending. If you're enjoying the show, do remember to hit subscribe, and if you can leave us a review on Apple or Spotify, it all helps with the old rankings. But until next time, have a lovely week, and we'll see you back here on I Completed 80s Music. Take care.